Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive into psychopathology. I think a lot of people are kind of curious about the history of mental illness. Like, how do people used to think about it?
Right.
All that. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And to kind of guide us, I've got a fantastic expert here.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely happy to be here.
You brought along an excerpt from a psychology textbook that focuses on historical perspectives of psychopathology, so we're going to use that as our jumping off point for this really fascinating deep dive. And by the end of it, you'll not only be able to impress your friends
Yeah.
with your knowledge of psych, but I think also kind of gain a deeper appreciation for how far we've come in understanding the human mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because, looking back at how mental illness was viewed throughout history can really give us some perspective on the progress we've made and also maybe some of the challenges that we still face.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with this? I mean, we're talking about centuries of history here.
Well, I think a good place to start is with ancient times.
Okay, so like way, way back.
Way, way back.
Before we knew anything about the brain, really.
Exactly. Because,
Yeah.
back then, any unusual behavior could be attributed to,
Yeah.
supernatural forces, demonic possession, things like that.
Oh, yeah, I was reading about that. It's kind of freaky to think about it. Like, imagine living in a time when, a headache could be seen as a sign of evil spirits.
Right, and it's easy to look back and say, well, that was just superstition. But you have to consider the context. People didn't have the tools, the knowledge to understand how the brain and body work.
Right. It's like they were trying to find some explanation for things that they just couldn't comprehend.
Exactly, and sometimes those explanations led to some pretty, interesting practices.
Yeah, what kind of practices are we talking about?
Well, for example,
Trepanation.
trepanation.
Yeah, drilling holes in people's skulls.
Wait, they actually did that as a treatment?
Oh, yeah. Archaeological evidence shows that. Trepanation was practiced across different cultures for thousands of years. That's wild.
Yeah, and I know it seems barbaric to us now.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that. People were desperate for solutions.
Right. They were trying to alleviate suffering.
Exactly. And they were working with
Yeah.
a very limited understanding of how the body and mind worked.
So it really highlights that human impulse to find solutions, even if those solutions are based on, a very different understanding than we have today.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's fascinating and terrifying at the same time. It definitely makes you appreciate how far we've come
It does.
in understanding the brain and mental illness.
Yeah. And, from there, we can kind of fast forward to ancient Greece, where we see a bit of a shift away from the supernatural and towards a more naturalistic view of mental illness.
Okay, so the Greeks were a little more progressive.
In some ways, yes. And one figure we can't talk about without mentioning this period is Hippocrates,
Oh, yeah, Hippocrates.
often considered the father of Western medicine.
I remember learning about him in school. Wasn't he the one who came up with the theory of the four humors?
That's right. Hippocrates believed that both physical and mental health were determined by the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
Okay, the four humor. So like an excess of one humor
Yeah.
could lead to certain personality traits
Exactly.
or illnesses.
Yeah. So, for example, an excess of black bile was thought to cause melancholia.
Which we might now recognize as depression.
Right.
So the specifics of the theory maybe weren't quite right.
Yeah.
But the core idea, the mental and physical health, were connected, that there were biological underpinnings to mental states.
That was huge.
That was a huge step forward.
It was revolutionary.
Yeah.
Especially considering this was happening in the 5th century BC.
Wow.
Hippocrates was already pushing back against supernatural explanations
Mm-hmm.
and advocating for a more holistic understanding of health.
And that idea of balance,
Yes.
of finding equilibrium within the body, that's something that still resonates in modern medicine.
It does, doesn't it?
Even if we've moved beyond the four humors.
Oh,
Yeah, we still talk about the importance of a balanced diet, exercise, stress management, all these things that contribute to our overall well-being, both physically and mentally.
Exactly. And actually, there's a fascinating example of this holistic approach in practice. We can see it in the treatment of King Charles VI of France.
Okay, King Charles VI.
He suffered from what we might now call a psychotic disorder.
And instead of, resorting to exorcisms or other harsh treatments, what did they do?
Well, his physicians prescribed rest, a healthy diet, and a change of scenery.
Wow, that sounds surprisingly modern.
It does, doesn't it?
Like something a therapist might recommend today.
Right. And it shows that even back then, there was a recognition that the environment could play a significant role in mental health.
That's incredible. So we've gone from demons to humors, and with each step, we see this growing recognition of the complex interplay between the mind, the body, and the environment.
Precisely.
But I have a feeling this journey is far from over.
Oh, it's just getting started.
So as we move into the 19th century, I know this is when asylums start to become more prevalent.
Yes.
So let's dive into this complex and often unsettling chapter of psychopathology's history.
Let's do it. Okay, so the 19th century, this is really when we see psychiatry kind of emerging as a distinct medical specialty.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are definitely some positive developments, but also some practices that we now recognize as misguided and even harmful.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, it's a step forward in some ways, but still a long way to go.
Absolutely.
So who are some of the key figures that we should know about from this period?
Well, one of the big names is J.P. Gray. He was an American psychiatrist and a really strong advocate for the idea that mental illness had physical causes.
Okay. And that's something that we now know to be true.
In many cases, yes.
But back then, that was a pretty radical idea.
It was. And it led to some improvements in the living conditions of asylums.
Oh, really? Like, how so?
Well, for example, Gray advocated for better ventilation and sanitation in asylums.
Okay, so at least people were living in slightly more humane conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
But this focus on physical causes also had a downside.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Like, it makes sense that way.
Yeah.
If you believe mental illness is purely physical, then you might try to treat it with physical intervention.
Exactly. And some of those interventions were pretty questionable.
Like, what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, bloodletting, for example,
Bloodletting.
still persisted as a way to, you know, rebalance the body's humors.
Even though it had no scientific basis.
Right. And induced vomiting was often used to treat depression.
Induced vomiting?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
So,
Imagine.
I mean, adding nausea to an already depressed state doesn't exactly seem like a recipe for healing.
No, not at all.
So it's like, even with good intentions, the pursuit of scientific understanding can take some misguided turns.
Absolutely.
But amidst all of this, there were also some genuine breakthroughs happening.
Yes, definitely.
So what were some of the positive developments?
Well, one of the most influential figures of this era was Emil Kraeplin.
Kraeplin.
He was a German psychiatrist. And he did something really important. He attempted to classify mental disorders in a systematic way,
Oh, that's interesting.
much like physical illnesses were categorized.
So bringing order and structure to the understanding of mental illness
Did that.
seems like that would be a huge step forward.
It was, and it really laid the foundation
Okay.
for more effective diagnosis and treatment.
So he was kind of creating a roadmap of the mind.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He was trying to make sense of all these different
Yeah.
presentations of mental illness and organize them in a way that would help doctors understand them better.
And I'm guessing some of the diagnostic categories
Yes.
that he came up with are still relevant today.
Absolutely. Things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, those were categories that Kraeplin really helped to define.
Wow, so his work was really foundational.
It was.
Okay, so I've got J.P. Gray focusing on the physical causes of mental illness and Kraeplin trying to create a classification system. What else was happening in the 19th century?
Well, alongside these developments, we also see the rise of asylums as the primary place for treating people with mental illness.
Right, and asylums have this kind of complicated history
You do.
because on the one hand, they were meant to provide a place of refuge
Yeah.
for people who are struggling.
Right.
But on the other hand, they often became overcrowded, understaffed, and places where people were subjected to some pretty harsh treatments.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was often the case.
So it's like a mixed bag, some progress being made, but also some really serious problems.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I'm ready to move on to the 20th century because I know that's when we start to see some really radical treatments emerge.
Yes, like
Yeah.
insulin shock therapy
Yeah.
and electroconvulsive therapy.
ECT. These weren't exactly gentle procedures.
No, they were not.
So let's talk about those.
Okay.
Okay, so insulin shock therapy and ECT. These were pretty controversial treatments.
Yeah, they were. And, you know, they're not really used anymore, at least not in the same way. But it's important to understand why they were developed and what the thinking was behind them.
Okay, so let's start with insulin shock therapy. What was that all about?
Well, basically, it involved inducing comas in patients
Comas.
by giving them large doses of insulin.
I mean, that sounds terrifying.
It was a very risky procedure.
And what was the supposed benefit of this?
The idea was that by kind of resetting the brain in this extreme way, it could alleviate symptoms of schizophrenia.
So they were basically trying to shock the system.
In a way, yes.
And did it work?
Well, some patients did show temporary improvement, but we now understand that. That was probably due to the intensive care and attention they received during treatment, rather than the coma itself.
Okay, so not really a cure.
No.
Oh.
And unfortunately, many patients suffered serious side effects, including permanent brain damage. And some even died from the procedure.
Wow. So a tragic example of scientific exploration gone wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And what about ECT, electroconvulsive therapy?
So ECT is still used today.
Right.
But it's much more carefully regulated.
And the methods are much more refined.
Exactly. Back then it was used much more liberally.
Yeah.
And the techniques were less advanced. So there were significant side effects.
Like memory loss.
Yes.
And confusion.
Right.
So it's a reminder that science is a process.
It is.
Of trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those trials can have some pretty devastating consequences.
That's true.
But it's also important to remember that even these misguided treatments often came from a place of wanting to help.
Absolutely. The doctors who were using these treatments, they genuinely believed that they were doing what was best for their patients.
And they were working with the knowledge that they had at the time.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the darker chapters of psychopathology's history.
Yeah.
But the 20th century also saw the rise of some really important psychological approaches to mental illness.
Right. And I think the most influential figure here is Sigmund Freud.
Oh, yes, Freud. The men who brought us, the Oedipus complex. And the idea that our mothers are to blame for all our problems.
Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification.
I'm just kidding. But seriously, Freud's impact on how we think about the mind is undeniable.
It is. He really shifted the focus away from purely biological explanations of mental illness and towards the inner workings of the mind.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't spent years on the therapist's couch, can you give us a crash course in Freudian thinking?
Sure. So one of Freud's key ideas was the concept of the unconscious.
The unconscious.
Yes. This is the part of our mind that we're not aware of, but that influences our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors.
Okay, so like all those hidden desires.
And repressed memories.
Yeah,
Exactly. And Freud believed that many mental illnesses stem from conflicts in the unconscious mind.
So like unresolved childhood trauma, things like that.
Yes.
And he developed psychoanalysis as a way to help people bring those unconscious conflicts to the surface.
Exactly. The goal of psychoanalysis was to make the unconscious conscious so that people could understand and work through those hidden forces that were driving their behaviors.
Okay, that makes sense. But Freud wasn't the only one who was making waves in the 20th century.
No. There were other important schools of thought that emerged.
Like behaviorism.
Yes.
Which took a very different approach to understanding the mind.
Right. Behaviorism focused on observable behaviors rather than internal mental processes.
So it's not about what's going on inside your head. It's about how you act.
Exactly.
Right? How those actions are shaped by your environment.
Right.
So like if I reward my dog for sitting, he's more likely to sit again in the future.
Exactly. That's operant conditioning.
Okay.
And then there's classical conditioning.
Which is all about learning through association.
Right. Like Pavlov's dogs.
Oh, yeah.
Who learned to salivate at the sound of a bell.
Because they associated the bell with food.
Exactly.
And this same principle can be applied to understand how we develop phobias.
And other anxiety.
Right. Because we can learn to associate a harmless object or situation with fear or danger.
Exactly.
So behaviorism is all about understanding how our behaviors are learned and then using that knowledge to modify those behaviors.
Right.
Whether we're talking about, you know, helping someone overcome a phobia.
Or teaching a dog to sit.
Right, exactly. Right. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient beliefs about demons to the rise of asylums, from Freud's exploration of the unconscious to the behaviorists' focus on observable actions. It's been quite a journey through the history of psychopathology.
It has.
And it's amazing to see how far we've come in understanding the mind.
It is.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge that we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely.
Still so much that we don't know.
Right. And even the things we think we know are constantly being challenged and revised.
So it's about staying curious,
Yes.
remaining open to new discoveries, and approaching mental health with empathy and compassion. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of psychopathology. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this journey through history and that you're leaving with some new insights, a sense of wonder, and perhaps a few questions to ponder.
And if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the resources that we'll be sharing in the show notes.
Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged, because a journey of discovery never truly ends.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you in the next video.